The soldier was still breathing when they carried her in. That was the only good news. 4 soldiers brought Corporal Dara Osei through the medical bay doors at a dead run. Her body was limp between their arms. Her chest armor had been melted away. The skin beneath, it was gone too. What remained was a wet dark wound the size of a fist that moved when she breathed. Each breath made a sound like paper tearing. Her eyes were half open, but she was not seeing anything. Not the white ceiling above her. Not the faces of her squad mates. Not the strange blue lights of the GCU unyielding resolve medical bay that hummed day and night like a living thing. She was 23 years old. The ship carried soldiers from 11 different species. They had been fighting the Vreth Collective for 7 months above the scorched surface of Vareth 9. The Vreth did not use guns the way the Coalition did. They used chemistry. Their acid lances were small and silent, and they put a burning compound directly into the body. That did not stop eating until there was nothing left to eat. Coalition forces had lost more soldiers to Vreth-acid weapons than to any other cause in the war. The burns on the outside were bad. The damage on the inside was worse. And by the time a soldier made it to medical, it was usually already over. The doors opened again. Chief Medical Officer Sorval entered without running. His kind did not run unless the ship itself was on fire. He was Keth'ran, tall, thin, with 4 pale eyes set wide in a smooth, gray face and fingers that were too long for a human hand, but perfectly designed for surgical work. He had been practicing medicine for 61 years. His people had been practicing medicine for 4,000. When Sorval walked into a room, the other medical staff stopped talking and paid attention. Not because they feared him, because he was always right. He moved to the table where Dara lay and placed a scanner over the wound without a word. The scanner was small and silver, and it read tissue chemistry in real time. He watched the numbers. He moved the scanner slowly. He checked 3 times. He turned to the 2 other alien physicians behind him. A short round Palari doctor named Voss and a Marath field surgeon named Ikeel, who had 6 arms and used all of them when she worked. He showed them the readings. They looked. They looked again. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Sorval set the scanner down, gently on the tray beside him. The compound was already past the chest wall. It had moved through the lower lobe of the left lung and was working toward the major vessels near the heart. The progression rate at current speed would reach the heart in approximately 18 minutes. There was no known Coalition compound that could stop or reverse Vreth acid at that stage. The tissue was not damaged. It was gone, dissolved at a cellular level and still dissolving. Sorval had seen this wound before. He had seen it 11 times in 7 months. He knew exactly what it meant. He turned to the squad, standing near the wall. 4 humans, exhausted, bleeding from smaller wounds of their own, watching him with wide eyes that already knew and were desperately hoping they were wrong. Sorval spoke with the calm of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had become its own kind of kindness. This patient has sustained irreversible damage to the thoracic cavity. The compound has passed the point where intervention can stop its progression. Continued surgical effort would not save her. It would only extend her suffering. By every standard in Coalition medicine, this wound is fatal. I recommend compassionate sedation. She will feel nothing. She will simply sleep. The room was very quiet. One of the soldiers made a sound that was not quite a word. Sorval was already turning. He had other patients. There was a Palhari soldier, 2 bays down with a shattered spine, and a Morath private who had lost 2 of her arms at the joint. The living needed him. This was not cruelty. This was medicine. This was the hard center of what medicine actually was. The ability to know when the body had already made its decision and to honor that with grace. He had taken 2 steps. When the voice came from behind him, step aside. It was not loud. It was not angry. It was the voice of someone who had already made a decision and was simply informing the room of it. Dr. Elena Vasquez came through the side door of the medical bay, still pulling on her gloves. She was not tall. She was not particularly impressive to look at. She had dark eyes and short hair and a scar along her jaw from a piece of shrapnel she had caught on a field assignment 3 years ago. She was 38 years old, and she had been a trauma surgeon for 12 of those years. She had been seconded to the GCU Unyielding Resolve from a United Earth Medical Corps 4 months ago. In that time, she had spoken maybe 200 words to the rest of the medical staff. She worked long hours, and she kept to herself, and most of the alien crew had quietly decided she was simply quiet by nature. They were about to find out they were wrong. Sorval stopped. He turned. He looked at her with the particular expression that very experienced doctors use when a younger colleague is about to make a mistake. Dr. Vasquez, the readings are conclusive. The compound is past the threshold. There is nothing surgical intervention can achieve except to delay the inevitable by minutes. The patient is in pain. Sedation is the compassionate choice. Vasquez did not look at Sorval. She was already at the table. She was already reading the scanner. She was already pulling the equipment tray toward her with the focused efficiency of someone who had been running through the problem in her head since the moment she heard the soldiers come through the door. I heard you the first time, she said. Sorval took a slow breath. Doctor, I have 61 years of surgical experience. This compound has no counteragent at this stage. You cannot outrun it. The math does not permit it. Vasquez snapped on her second glove. She looked up for just a moment, and her dark eyes found his 4 pale ones. Good thing I was never very good at math, she said. And then she went to work. Behind her, the squad of soldiers did not move. They stood along the wall, and they watched, and none of them could have explained why they were not leaving. There was something in the way she moved. Something in the way she did not hesitate. Something in the complete and total absence of the word impossible in everything she did. Sorval stood at the edge of the room and watched too. He told himself he was staying to be available when it failed. He almost believed it. The first thing Vasquez did was something that made no sense to anyone watching. She called for cold saline. Not warm. Not body temperature the way every coalition medical protocol demanded for open chest wounds. Cold. As cold as the ship could produce. When the nurse brought it, she poured it directly into the wound. And the soldier on the table made a sound. And her body tensed, and Sorval took a step forward. Because in coalition medicine you did not cause additional pain to a terminal patient, and this was exactly that. Vasquez held up one hand without looking at him. The hand said, stop. The hand said, I know what I am doing. The hand said, trust me, even though she had given him no reason to, and the patient had no time for reasons. Anyway, Sorval stopped. The cold saline hit the wound and the dissolving slowed. Not stopped, slowed. Just enough. The Vreth acid compound worked faster at body temperature. It fed on warmth. It used the heat of the body to accelerate its chemistry. This was not in the Coalition medical database. It was not in any paper Sorval had read. But it was in the notes of a human biochemist named Dr. Priya Ankosi, who had spent 2 years studying captured Vreth weapons in a lab outside New Nairobi and had published her findings in a journal that the Coalition had never indexed because it was written in English, and the translation algorithm had flagged it as low priority. Vasquez had read it on a Tuesday afternoon when she was bored. With the progression rate cut by 1/3, she had more time. Not much, but a little. And a little was everything. She called for surgical tubing. 2 lengths. A pressure clamp. A set of microconnectors designed for Keth'ran vascular surgery, because they were the smallest ones on the ship. The nurse handed them across without understanding why. Vasquez was already cutting. She opened the chest wall further with a motion so precise and so fast that Vos the Pulhari doctor made a small noise of surprise and pressed closer to see. What she was building was not in any surgical manual in any language. It was a bypass. A manual reroute. She was going to take the function of the dissolving lower lobe, and she was going to give it somewhere else to go. The upper lobe was clean. She was going to make it do the work of both. This was not possible. Every physician in the room knew it was not possible. The human lung did not work that way. You could not simply redirect the function of one lobe to another with tubing and a clamp. The pressures were wrong. The volumes were wrong. The tissue was not designed for it. Vasquez connected the first tube and the upper lobe expanded in a way it was not supposed to expand, and Dara Osei took a breath that was deeper than any breath she had taken since she arrived. Soval stared at the scanner readout. The oxygenation level had gone up. He read it again, because he did not believe it the first time. Then he read it a third time, because he did not believe it the second time either. He stood very still for a moment, with the expression of a man who has built his entire understanding of a subject on a foundation that has just shifted. Underneath him, Vasquez did not look up. She was working on the second connection. Her hands did not shake. They never shook. She had a memory of her first year of residency in a hospital in Bogota, where her supervising surgeon had told her that steady hands were a gift you were born with or you were not, and she had gone home that night and spent 4 hours holding a pen perfectly still over a piece of paper until her arm cramped, and then she had switched arms and done it again. That was 20 years ago. Her hands had not shaken since. The acid was still moving. Cold saline bought time, but it did not buy forever. It was still eating through the lower lobe toward the main vessel cluster, and when it reached those vessels it would be over no matter what she had done with the tubes. She needed to stop the progression completely, and she had nothing to stop it with, because the coalition had no counter-agent at this stage, and the ship was not carrying any experimental compounds because nobody had thought to bring them, because nobody had survived long enough with this wound to make bringing them worthwhile. She looked at the tray in front of her. She looked at the chemical cabinet on the wall. She called for a calcium compound solution. The nurse hesitated because calcium compound solution was used for bone regeneration procedures, and there was nothing about a bone regeneration compound that was relevant to acid neutralization in any medical text the nurse had ever read. Vasquez said it again. Calm, flat, not unkind, but not asking twice. The nurse brought it. The calcium compound was alkaline. Strong alkaline. Breath acid was extraordinarily acidic. The chemistry was the same chemistry a child learned in school. Acid and alkaline together made a reaction. The reaction produced heat, which was a problem. But the cold saline was already in the cavity, and the heat of the reaction would be absorbed. She had 2 minutes at most before the acid reached the vessels. She did not do the calculation again because she had already done it in her head, on the way to the table, and the answer was the same. 2 minutes was enough if her hands were fast. And they were fast. She injected the calcium compound in a line directly ahead of the acid front. The reaction was immediate and violent, and the monitors screamed, and 3 separate alarms went off at once, and Ikeel, the Marath surgeon, actually moved toward the door because the readings looked like the patient was dying faster, not slower. The cavity temperature spiked. Then the cold saline pulled it back down. The acid front hit the alkaline compound, and the dissolving stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. A dark line in the tissue showed exactly where the chemistry had ended. Like a fire hitting a fire break, Sorval watched the scanner. The compound was no longer progressing. He did not say anything. He was not sure what he would have said. Then the heart monitor went flat. The sound it made was the worst sound in any medical bay in any language. One long, steady tone that meant that somewhere inside all of the improvised tubing and the cold saline and the chemistry, Dara Osei had simply stopped. Vasquez said one word quietly to herself in Spanish that nobody else in the room spoke, but everyone understood from her tone. Then she opened the chest further with both hands and reached inside and wrapped her fingers around the heart and began to compress it manually. One squeeze. A pause. Another squeeze. The rhythm of it, slow and deliberate and deeply strange, looking to every alien in the room, because Keth'ran hearts were not squeezed. Pelhari hearts could not be touched. The idea of putting your bare hands around the central organ of Another living being and forcing it to beat through nothing but physical pressure was so far outside. Coalition Surgical thinking that 3 of the staff watching genuinely did not understand what they were seeing for the first several seconds. Sorval understood. He had read the human medical files when Vasquez arrived. He had read about this. He had categorized it as a historical curiosity, a primitive technique from the early centuries of human medicine. He had not imagined he would ever see it performed. He had certainly not imagined it would work. She compressed the heart for 9 minutes. Nobody in the room spoke. The only sounds were the alarms and the soft rhythm of her hands and the low hum of the ship around them. The soldiers along the wall did not move. One of them was crying without making any sound at all. Sorval noticed this and found that he did not have a response to it, which was unusual for him. On the 9th minute, the defibrillator finished its recharge cycle. Vasquez stepped back. The paddles went on. The charge went in. Dara Osei's chest jumped. The monitor stayed flat. Vasquez did not change her face. She said, "Charge again." The nurse charged it. The paddles went on. The charge went in. The monitor jumped, fell back, jumped again, and then it found a rhythm. It was weak. It was irregular. It sounded nothing like the steady beat it was supposed to sound like. But it was a beat. It was a heart deciding that it was not finished. It was a body that had been told it was dead, looking at that information and choosing not to accept it. Vasquez let out one long, slow breath. She went back to closing. Behind her, Sorval stood completely still with the scanner in his hands and the readout in front of him showing numbers that his 61 years of medicine had no framework to explain. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked at the woman at the table, who was quietly humming something low under her breath while she sutured a chest. That should have been a body bag. He did not know the song. He suspected it did not matter. He suspected the song was not the point. The point was that she was still here. The patient was still here. The math had said no, and she had operated in the space between the math and the outcome, and she had found something there that the math had not accounted for. He did not have a word for what that something was. He was beginning to think maybe humans did. She was still alive in the morning. That was not supposed to be a sentence anyone said. It was not supposed to be information that existed. And yet when Sorval walked into the recovery ward at the start of the next shift and saw Corporal Dara Osei lying in the bed with 3 machines attached to her and the pulse reading on the monitor above her head, he stopped walking and stood in the doorway for a long moment, doing nothing at all. The readings were not good. She was not healthy. She was not safe. The repaired lung was working at less than half capacity, and her heart rhythm was still irregular, and she would not be moving on her own for weeks, and there were 17 things that could still go wrong in the next 48 hours that would kill her just as certainly as the wound would have. But she was here. She was breathing. The monitors were showing numbers instead of a flat line, and her hands. The monitors were showing numbers instead of a flat line, and her hands. Instead of a flat line, and her hands were resting quietly at her sides, and her face in sleep looked very young and very tired and very alive. Sorval stood there a moment longer than was necessary. Then he went to find Dr. Vasquez. He found her in the small corridor outside the surgical bay, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. Her scrubs were stained. Her eyes were half closed. She was eating something from a silver packet that humans called a nutrition bar, and she was eating it with the focused appreciation of someone who had not tasted anything in a very long time. She did not look like someone who had just done something that no physician in the coalition thought was possible. She looked like someone who was very tired and very hungry and had found a wall to lean against. Sorval sat down on the floor beside her. This was not something Keth'ran typically did. They sat in chairs or stood. The floor was not a place of rest for his people. It was a place you ended up when something had gone badly wrong. But there were no chairs in this corridor, and something told him that standing above her for this conversation was not right. He was not entirely sure where that instinct came from. He was beginning to suspect that being around humans for 4 months had changed some small things about him without his permission. She glanced sideways at him. She did not look surprised to see him there. She took another bite of the nutrition bar. He said, "How?" Just that. One word, not as a challenge. Not with any of the professional distance he usually kept around him like a coat. Just the honest question of a man who had spent 61 years being certain about medicine and had watched those certainties come apart at the seams over the past few hours. Vasquez chewed, swallowed, looked at the wall across from her. She thought about how to answer for a moment. Then she started talking. She told him about a man named James Blundell, a human physician who had lived 200 years ago on a small island on Earth. Blundell had been one of the first people to attempt blood transfusion between humans. The idea was simple. A patient losing blood needed blood. Give them blood from someone else. But at the time, most physicians thought this was impossible or dangerous, or both, and the early attempts failed, and patients died, and the medical establishment said clearly, "This does not work," and moved on. Blundell did not move on. He tried again differently. Failed differently. Tried again. Some of his patients lived. Some died. He kept notes on all of them. The ones who died taught him as much as the ones who lived, and sometimes more. He spent years inside the space between failure and understanding, and he kept going because he believed that the problem was not that blood transfusion was impossible. The problem was that he had not yet figured out how to do it right. He was right. And eventually, he was proven right. And because he refused to stop thousands of people who came after him, lived because of what his refusals and his failures had slowly built. Sorval listened. Vasquez told him about other people. About a woman named Elena Vasquez, who figured out that doctors were killing patients by not washing their hands, and spent years being laughed at by the medical community until the evidence became too large to ignore. About surgeons who had operated by candlelight in tents during wars. About doctors in places without medicine who had used what they had and invented the rest. About a whole civilization that had learned everything it knew. About keeping people alive from centuries of losing them. Human medicine was not old the way Keth'ran medicine was old. Keth'ran medicine was old like a mountain. Solid. Deep. Built over millennia into something that knew itself completely. Human medicine was old the way a river was old. It had cut its path by moving. By wearing things down. By finding the way through when the way was not obvious. By refusing to stop at the wall and instead working around it and under it, and sometimes straight through it, because the alternative was not moving, and not moving meant people died. She said, "We are not smarter than you. I want to be clear about that. Your pharmacology is better than ours. Your understanding of multi-species biology has no comparison. If I had to diagnose a rare Keth'ran blood condition, I would need your help, and I would not pretend otherwise." She stopped and looked at her hands. "But we learned medicine by losing people," she said. "For a long time, we lost a lot of people. And every time we lost someone, we wrote it down and we looked at it and we asked why, and we tried to make sure we lost fewer people the next time. We built everything we know out of grief and failure and the absolute refusal to accept that the next patient had to die the same way the last one did." She paused. "When your scanner said fatal," she said, "I heard that. I understood that. I knew what the numbers meant. But I also knew that numbers describe what has happened before. They do not get to decide what happens next. That is still being written. And I was not ready to stop writing it." Sorval was quiet for a long time. The ship hummed around them. Far away through the hull, the war continued. Somewhere a breathlance was being fired, and somewhere a soldier was falling. And somewhere a medical bay was making decisions about who could be saved and who could not. He said something then that he would not write in his official log because he was not sure it was a medical observation. He was not sure it was anything he had been trained to say. But it came out of him quietly and without planning, and it was true. He said, "I have believed for 60 One is that a physician's most important skill was knowing when to stop. Knowing when the body has made its decision and accepting that decision with grace. We call it wisdom. We teach it to every student on the first day. Know your limits. Honor the mathematics. Do not prolong suffering for the sake of the physician's pride. He looked at his own hands. But you do not have this wisdom, he said. And she lived. Vasquez looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than a smile. She said, "It is not that we do not know when to stop. We know. We feel it. Every doctor feels it. There is a moment in every impossible surgery where everything in you says this is where it ends. I felt it last night." Twice. She folded the empty nutrition wrapper carefully. "We just decided a long time ago. That feeling, that moment, and stopping at it were two different things," she said. "You can feel it and keep going. It is hard. It costs something. But you can do it." Sorrel sat with that for a long moment. Then he stood up from the floor slowly and straightened his coat and became once again the chief medical officer of the GCU, unyielding resolve, and not just a man sitting on a corridor floor having his life's work quietly reorganized by a tired human eating compressed food out of a silver packet. He said, "I would like to review your surgical notes from last night. If you are willing." She looked up at him. He said, "There are things you did that I do not understand, and I have never in 61 years said those words and meant them the way I mean them right now." Vasquez stood up, brushed off her scrubs. She said, "Come on then," and the two of them walked back into the medical bay together, and the door closed behind them. And in the recovery ward down the hall, Corporal Dara Osei breathed in and breathed out, and her heart beat its uneven, stubborn living beat against everything that had tried to stop it. The story moved fast, the way stories do on ships where there is not much else to hold on to. By the second day after the surgery, every soldier on the unyielding resolve knew what had happened. By the third day, the other ships in the fleet knew. By the end of the week, the story had reached the coalition command posts on the surface of Vareth 9, and comeback changed the way all stories come back changed when they travel far enough. In some versions, Vasquez had operated for 12 hours straight. In some versions, she had used equipment she built herself from nothing. In one version that a Murath private told very seriously to a group of human soldiers, the human doctor had argued with the ship's computer, and the human soldiers found this last version very funny, and also not entirely unbelievable. But what happened next was not a story. It was real, and it started quietly. A Polhari soldier arrived in the medical bay on day 4 with a crush injury to the chest that Voss's own physician had already assessed as unsurvivable. The liver was destroyed. The secondary circulatory vessel was torn. Voss had given him sedation and gone to write the death notation in the log, and when he came back, the soldier had pulled the sedation line out of his own arm and was lying there, awake and frightened, and asking in a voice very quiet if the human doctor was available. Voss stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to find Vasquez. She came. She looked at the readings. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What is his secondary vessel pressure?" And Voss told her, and she said, "And his remaining liver tissue percentage," and Voss told her that too, and she stood very still doing something in her head, and then she said, "All right," and picked up her gloves. She could not save his liver, but she could bridge it. She could create a bypass that would keep enough function going long enough for the secondary tissue to begin the regeneration process. The Polhari biology was actually very good at if the pressure on the system could be reduced enough to let it start. It was not a solution. It was a delay. But delays were the whole point. Delays were what the body needed. Give the body enough time, and it would often save itself. That was the whole secret. That was the whole of it. You just had to give it time. The Polhari soldier was in recovery by morning. Voss did not say much afterward. But when Vasquez passed him in the corridor, he looked at her in a way that was not quite the way he had looked at her before. A careful look. The look of someone remeasuring a distance. They thought they already knew. After the Polhari soldier came a Morath private with a spinal compression that Aikil had classified as permanently paralyzing. Vasquez and Aikil worked it together for 6 hours. The private walked with a limp for the rest of the war, but she walked. After that came 2 more human soldiers with acid wounds. Then a Keth'ran engineer who had been caught in an explosion and had 3 internal bleeds that Sorval himself had opened and then closed again because the angle was impossible. Vasquez asked him to show her the scans, and she looked at them for a long time and then showed him a technique she called a lateral approach that no Keth'ran surgeon had ever used, because Keth'ran anatomy made it unnecessary for them. But the geometry of it worked on any bilateral species if you were willing to take the angle. They operated side by side. Sorval later wrote in his private log that he had learned more in those 6 hours than in 5 years of continuing education at the Keth'ran Medical Institute. He did not share this with anyone on the ship. He was not sure he was ready to say it out loud yet, but he wrote it down because it was true, and he had always been honest in his private log. Even when honesty was uncomfortable, the medical bay changed. Slowly and then quickly, the way things change when someone decides to stop accepting the way things are. Vasquez reorganized the cold storage of emergency compounds because she had opinions about compound accessibility that nobody had asked for, but that turned out to save 2 minutes in critical situations, and 2 minutes was everything. She posted a handwritten card above the main surgical table that said the outcome is not decided yet, and it was written in her own handwriting in English, and she translated it into Keth'ran and Talarian Morath and stuck those up too. The alien staff looked at the cards with various expressions, some confused, some thoughtful. One junior Keth'ran nurse put a copy of it above her own station. Then Sorval found her sitting on the floor again. It was late. The bay was quiet. They had just lost a patient, a Morath soldier named Icon III, who had come in with a brain bleed from a concussive impact. They had worked on him for 4 hours. Vasquez and Sorval and Aikil, all 3 at once. They had tried everything in the order. It made sense to try it. And then they had tried things in orders that made no sense, and those had not worked either. He had died on the table at the end of the 4th hour, and the monitor had gone flat, and this time nobody called for a charge, because the brain was gone and you could not reach inside a brain and compress it with your hands, and there was nothing left to bridge or bypass or delay. She was sitting with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and her head down. Sorval sat beside her again. He was getting better at sitting on floors. He did not say anything. He did not have the right thing to say, and he had learned enough in the past weeks to know that saying the wrong thing was worse than silence. So he sat. The ship hummed. The lights in the corridor were dimmed for night cycle. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm for someone who was still here. After a while, she lifted her head. She said, "I keep thinking about the ones I could not get to in time. On Earth, I mean. Before all this, there was a boy in Bogota, 17 years old. Came in too late. I have thought about him probably once a week for 12 years. Sorval listened. She said, "I think that is why we do not stop." She said it slowly, like she was finding the words while she spoke them. Not just in surgery. In general. In everything. We carry the ones we lost. We carry them forward. They are the weight that pushes us to be faster next time and smarter next time, and to find the technique that did not exist yet the last time. The dead teach us. They do not want to, but they do. And we owe them the courtesy of learning. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I could not save Icon III. I could not. But I know 3 things now that I did not know this morning, and one of them might save someone else next month, and that person might save someone else after that. He's still teaching. Even now. Even gone." Sorval considered this for a long time. In Keth'ran culture, the dead were honored by release. You let them go. You did not carry them. Carrying them was considered a failure of healing, a clinging to grief that prevented the living from moving forward cleanly. It was one of the oldest tenets of Keth'ran philosophy. 4,000 years of it. He said nothing about this to Vasquez. He was quietly wondering if 4,000 years of his people had simply decided that carrying the dead was too heavy and built a philosophy around putting them down. He was wondering if humans had decided the weight was worth it. He stood up. He straightened his coat. He said, "Tomorrow, I want to discuss the lateral approach application for Keth'ran and Palhari combined surgeries. I believe there is a variation that neither of us has considered." She looked up at him. He held out one long gray hand. She took it and stood up, and they went back inside. 6 weeks after a wound that should have killed her, Corporal Dara Osei stood up from a chair without help. It took her a while. Her jaw was tight, and her hand gripped the bedframe, and the effort showed in every line of her face. The two machines still attached to her beeped in mild alarm, as if they were not sure what she thought she was doing. She ignored them. She moved her left foot forward, then her right. Then she let go of the bedframe, and she was standing on her own in the middle of the recovery ward with nothing holding her up but herself. Nobody was watching. It was early morning. The ward was quiet. The only witness was a junior Keth'ran nurse named Seal, who was updating medication logs at the far end of the room and who looked up at the sound of movement and went very still. Dara stood there for a moment, breathing. She could feel the work her body was doing to keep her upright. The repaired lung pulling and expanding. The heart that had been stopped and started again beating steadily now. A scar on her chest that itched sometimes in the night. She had been told the itching meant it was healing. She had decided to believe that. She took 2 more steps to the window. Outside the ship Varath 9 hung in the dark below them. Brown and gray and damaged, but still there. The Vreth Collective had withdrawn from the third continent 4 days ago. The war was not over, but it was bending, slowly, in the way that terrible things bend when enough people refuse to let them stand. She put her hand against the glass and looked out, and she was alive. Seal, the nurse, set down the medication, logged very quietly, and went to tell Dr. Vasquez. The ceremony was held 3 days later, in the main assembly hall of the Unyielding Resolve. It was not a grand space. It was a functional room with rows of seats and a low stage at the front and lighting that was designed for briefings, not for occasions. But it was full. Every species on the ship was represented. Human soldiers sat beside Keth'ran officers, beside Palhari engineers, beside Morath field teams, and the room had the particular feeling of a place where something real was about to happen. Commander Oravet stood at the front. She was Keth'ran, Senior Military Command. She had 4 decades of service, and she ran the ship the way Saral ran the medical bay, with precision and calm and the deep certainty of someone who had seen a great deal and expected to understand what they saw. She had spent the last 6 weeks being consistently surprised, and she was beginning to suspect this was going to be a permanent condition. She introduced Sorval. He walked to the front of the room and stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled crew for a moment before he spoke. He was not someone who used ceremonies for performance. He used words because they were the right words, and he stopped when there were no more right words, and this was respected throughout the coalition as the Keth'ran way. He said the following: 6 weeks ago, I declared a wound fatal. I did so correctly. Every reading supported the conclusion. Every protocol confirmed it. Every year of my training and experience told me that the correct and compassionate choice was to let the patient go. I believed I was right. He paused. I was wrong, he said. The room was completely silent. He said, I have spent the weeks since that night trying to understand not just the techniques Dr. Vasquez used, but the philosophy behind them. I have read human medical history. I have spoken with human doctors and soldiers and engineers on this ship. I have sat on the floor of a corridor at 2 in the morning and listened to a woman explain to me why her civilization carries its dead instead of releasing them, and I have not stopped thinking about that conversation since. He looked down at the podium for a Phi Emperor Silver Siversias moment. He said Keth'ran medicine has been built over 4,000 years on the principle of honoring the mathematics. The data tells us what is possible and what is not, and we trust the data because the data has been built from true things. This is not wrong. This has saved countless lives across the coalition for centuries. He looked up. But human medicine was built differently, he said. It was built from the opposite direction. It was built from the losses. From every patient who died on the table and every surgeon who stood over them afterward and asked why and tried to answer that question better the next time. Human medicine did not start with wisdom. It started with grief, and it turned that grief into knowledge. And it has been doing that for as long as humans have been human. He reached into his coat and removed a single folded piece of paper and set it on the podium. He said the Keth'ran Medical Institute, which is the oldest medical body in the coalition, has proposed and unanimously approved a new classification in the coalition medical standard. It replaces the existing binary of survivable and unsurvivable for critical trauma patients. He unfolded the paper. He read it. The new classification is prognosis contested. He looked up. It means the following: that there are patients whose wounds exceed the current limits of understood treatment. That in these cases the data cannot determine the outcome with certainty. That a physician who chooses to continue intervention in a prognosis-contested case is not defying medicine. They are practicing it at its furthest edge. And that the furthest edge is where medicine has always moved forward from. He refolded the paper. This is the first change to the coalition medical classification system in 812 years, he said. The Institute considered it for 4 days and approved it by unanimous vote. They asked me what prompted the proposal. He looked across the room to where Vasquez was sitting in the third row with her arms folded and her expression carefully neutral. I told them the truth, he said. I told them that a human doctor did something I had classified as impossible and that the patient was alive because of it, and that the only honest response to that was to expand what we considered possible. He picked up the paper. He walked off the stage and down the steps and through the rows, and he stopped in front of Vasquez, and he held the paper out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it. The room was quiet for another moment. Then it was not quiet at all. When the noise settled and the ceremony was over and people had begun to move toward the doors, Vasquez stayed in her seat for a moment. She looked at the paper in her hands. She read the words again. Prognosis contested. 3 words. A small change on paper. An enormous change in what it meant to be a patient at the edge of what medicine could do. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She found Dara Osei at the back of the room. The corporal was standing with a cane. She was thinner than she had been and would be for a while. Her eyes were clear and her back was straight. And she was talking quietly to the soldiers from her squad who were gathered around her like she was something they had been afraid they would not get to stand next to again. Vasquez did not interrupt. She stood near the door and watched for a moment. Dara caught her eye across the room. She did not say anything. She could not say anything from that distance. But she held Vasquez's gaze for a long, steady moment, and in that look was everything that neither of them had the right words for. All of it, every minute of that night. Every compression of a hand around a stopped heart. Every decision made in the space between the data and the outcome. Every reason to stop and every reason to keep going, and the fact that one of them had chosen one and the other had survived because of it. Vasquez gave her a small nod. Dara gave one back. Then she turned away and kept talking to her friends, and she laughed at something one of them said. The laugh was real and full, and it moved through her whole body, and she was alive in every part of it. Vasquez walked out of the hall into the corridor. Sorval fell into step beside her. They walked together in silence for a moment. Down the long corridor toward the medical bay. Past the little card on the wall above Seal's station that said in 4 languages, "The outcome is not decided yet." Sorval said, "I have been thinking about what you told me about carrying the dead." She looked at him. He said, "I think my people made a decision a long time ago that the weight was too much. that carrying it would break us. And we built 4,000 years of beautiful, careful, wise medicine on top of that decision, and it has served us very well. He was quiet for a moment. He said, but I think we may have also put down something we should have kept. Vasquez did not answer right away. She thought about the boy in Bogota. She thought about Icon III. She thought about everyone she had carried for 12 years and how heavy they were, and how she would not put a single one of them down even if she could. She said, it does not break you, she said. That is the thing. You think it will, especially at the beginning. But it does not. It just becomes part of you. And the part it becomes is the part that does not stop. Sorhol considered this for a long time. The ship hummed around them. The war continued outside. Somewhere a soldier was falling, and somewhere a medical bay was making its decisions. But here in this corridor on this ship there were two doctors walking toward the place where people needed them, and one of them had 61 years of the most advanced medicine in the galaxy, and one of them had 12 years of refusing to accept the word impossible, and together they were something that neither had a name for, yet something new, something that had not existed before that night 6 weeks ago, when a 23-year-old soldier had been carried through a door, and a man who knew everything had said fatal, and a woman who carried her dead had said step aside. Behind them in the assembly hall,